The text message glowed on David's phone screen as he showered upstairs, and what I read made my blood turn to ice. Phase 3 complete. Emma's appointment with Dr. Williams is next Tuesday. After that evaluation, even her own family will think she's losing it. Then we can finally move forward with our plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen in our Charlotte kitchen, David's phone heavy in my trembling hands. The response from someone named Ashley made my stomach lurch. Perfect. Can't wait to start our new life together once she's committed. You're brilliant at this manipulation thing. My name is Emma Richardson, and until that moment, I thought my husband of 7 years was trying to help me through what he called my mental health struggles. I thought he was being supportive when he gently corrected my memory about conversations we'd had. I thought he was protecting me when he suggested I might be imagining the strange sounds in our house at night. I thought he loved me when he scheduled the psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Williams, claiming he was worried about my increasing forgetfulness and paranoia. But standing there in our Myers Park home, reading message after message between my husband and his coworker Ashley Morgan, I realized I wasn't losing my mind at all. I was being systematically destroyed by the man I trusted most in the world. 3 hours earlier, I had been Emma Richardson, devoted wife and marketing professional, bustling around our kitchen preparing David's favorite breakfast before his big real estate conference in Atlanta. I had been the woman who apologized constantly for misremembering things, who second-guessed every instinct, who had started leaving sticky notes around the house because I could no longer trust my own memory. I had been the woman who gratefully accepted my husband's suggestion that I needed professional help, who felt lucky to have such a patient and understanding partner during my apparent mental decline. Now I was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that every moment of confusion, every instance of self-doubt, every time I had questioned my own sanity over the past 18 months had been carefully orchestrated by the man sleeping in my bed each night. David's phone had been sitting on the kitchen counter, buzzing with text notifications while he was in the shower. Normally, I would never have looked. I respected his privacy, trusted him completely. But something about the frequency of the messages and the late hour made me glance over. The screen showed partial previews of the conversation, and what I could see made my heart skip beats. When I picked up the phone, it was still unlocked from his last use. I told myself I would just check to make sure it wasn't an emergency with one of his clients. David worked in high-end real estate in Charlotte's most exclusive neighborhoods, and wealthy clients sometimes had crises that couldn't wait until morning. But the messages weren't from clients. They were from Ashley Morgan, a 29-year-old agent in his office whom I'd met at company parties. Ashley, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and ambitious smile, who always seemed to find excuses to touch David's arm during conversations, and laugh just a little too hard at his jokes. The conversation thread stretched back months. I scrolled up with growing horror, watching a methodical plan unfold in reverse chronological order. These weren't the passionate exchanges of a typical affair. They were cold, calculated discussions about psychological manipulation techniques, about how to make someone doubt their own reality, about the legal procedures for having someone declared mentally incompetent. The journal entries you planted in her purse worked perfectly, one message from Ashley read. She found them yesterday and was completely confused about writing things she doesn't remember. She actually called me crying, asking if I thought she was losing her mind. I remembered that call. 2 weeks ago, I had discovered a small notebook in my purse filled with handwriting that looked like mine but contained rambling, paranoid thoughts about David and strange accusations I would never make. The content was so unlike anything I would write that I had been terrified I was experiencing some kind of dissociative episode. I had called Ashley because she was one of the few people who knew about my recent memory issues, and I trusted her advice as someone who had studied psychology in college. Ashley had been so sympathetic on the phone, so concerned and caring. She had gently suggested that maybe the stress of my job was affecting me more than I realized, that perhaps David's idea about seeing a therapist wasn't such a bad one. Now I understood that she had been following a script, pushing me toward the very evaluation she and David had been planning. Another message from David made my knees weak. The hearing aid frequency worked again last night. She woke up convinced she heard whispers in the walls. I acted like I couldn't hear anything and suggested she might be having auditory hallucinations. She's starting to really doubt herself now. The hearing aid frequency. David's elderly father had given him an old hearing aid device when he upgraded to a newer model. David had mentioned it was broken and he was going to throw it away, but apparently he had found a much more sinister use for it. Certain frequencies could create subtle sounds that might not be noticeable to everyone, especially if someone was expecting them or knew what to listen for. For months, I had been waking up at night convinced I heard faint whispers or scratching sounds in the walls. David always slept peacefully through these episodes, which made me feel like I was either imagining things or incredibly sensitive to sounds he couldn't detect. He would hold me and comfort me, suggesting that stress and exhaustion might be making me hypervigilant to normal house sounds. Sometimes he would get up and check around the house to reassure me, never finding anything unusual. Now I realized he had been deliberately creating those sounds to make me question my sanity, then positioning himself as the caring husband trying to help his unstable wife. The messages revealed a systematic campaign that had been going on for over a year. David had been moving items in our house and then acting confused when I couldn't find them where I remembered leaving them. He had been making subtle changes to our shared calendar and then expressing concern when I showed up for plans that had been canceled or arrived at events on the wrong dates. He had been deleting text messages from my phone and then asking about responses to messages I had no memory of receiving. Most cruelly, he had been recording conversations we had and then playing them back to me later with subtle edits, making it seem like I had agreed to things I would never consent to or said things that were completely out of character. When I expressed confusion about these recordings, he would gently suggest that I might be having memory problems and should consider seeing a doctor. The psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Patricia Williams was supposed to be the culmination of this campaign. According to the messages, David had already had preliminary conversations with Dr. Williams, presenting her with a carefully constructed narrative about his wife's declining mental state. He had shared the planted journal entries, described my paranoid episodes about hearing voices, and documented my increasing forgetfulness and confusion. Ashley's responses showed her deep involvement in the plan. She had been helping David research gaslighting techniques, suggesting new ways to make me doubt my reality, and even participating in some of the manipulation. She had been the one to recommend specific psychological pressure points to target, drawing on her college psychology courses to advise David on how to most effectively destabilize my sense of reality. But the most devastating revelation was their motive. This wasn't just about David wanting to leave me for Ashley. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, so that David could take control of my financial assets and inheritance. My grandmother had left me a substantial trust fund when she passed away 2 years ago, money that was legally mine but that David couldn't access without my consent or court order. The house we lived in was also in my name, purchased with my inheritance before our marriage. David's real estate career was successful, but he had expensive tastes and significant debts that I was only now beginning to understand. The messages revealed that David owed money to several high-end clients for property deals that had gone wrong. He had been living beyond his means for years, maintaining an image of success while quietly accumulating debt. Ashley was facing her own financial pressures, having made some poor investment decisions with her real estate commissions. Together, they had developed a plan to solve both their problems. If I could be declared mentally incompetent, David would gain control of my assets as my husband and legal guardian. They could sell the house, liquidate my investments, and start fresh with a substantial nest egg. The psychiatric evaluation was meant to provide the professional documentation they would need to pursue legal guardianship. Once she's committed for observation, it will be easy to get permanent guardianship, David had texted. Dr. Williams already thinks Emma's showing signs of serious psychological deterioration based on what I've told her. The evaluation is just a formality. Ashley had responded with heart emojis and messages about their future together, about the luxury condo they would buy in South End, and the European vacation they would take once the money was accessible. They discussed David's divorce timeline, how long he would need to maintain the charade of being a caring husband before he could claim irreconcilable differences and leave me in whatever psychiatric facility they managed to get me committed to. The cruelest part was how convincing David's performance had been. For 18 months, he had been the perfect concerned husband, patient with my apparent memory lapses, gentle when correcting my confused recollections, supportive of my increasing need for professional help. He had held me when I cried about feeling like I was losing my mind. He had researched therapists and medications, accompanied me to preliminary doctor visits, and constantly reassured me that we would get through this together. Every moment of comfort he had provided had been calculated manipulation. Every expression of love and concern had been part of an elaborate performance designed to rob me of my sanity, my freedom, and my financial independence. I heard the shower turn off upstairs and quickly placed David's phone back where I had found it, my mind racing through everything I had learned. He would be down in a few minutes, ready to continue his performance as the devoted husband preparing for a business trip. He would probably mention how worried he was about leaving me alone before my appointment with Dr. Williams, how he wished he could reschedule his conference to be there with me. The appointment, Tuesday, was only 5 days away. According to the messages, David had told Dr. Williams that this evaluation was urgent, that my condition seemed to be deteriorating rapidly, and he was concerned about my safety and the safety of others. He had painted a picture of a woman on the edge of a complete psychological breakdown, someone who might need immediate intervention and possibly hospitalization. For months, I had been looking forward to this appointment with the same mixture of hope and terror that accompanies any moment of potential diagnosis. I had wanted answers for why I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, why my memory seemed unreliable, why I felt constantly anxious and confused. I had been prepared to accept whatever Dr. Williams discovered, grateful to finally. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Understand what was happening to me. Now I realized that Dr. Williams was going into our session with a completely false understanding of my mental state, armed with fabricated evidence and manipulated information. Unless I could find a way to reveal the truth, this evaluation would be the final step in David's plan to destroy my life. But as I stood in my kitchen, still processing the magnitude of what I had discovered, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. For the first time in over a year, everything made perfect sense. I wasn't losing my mind, I wasn't having memory problems. I wasn't experiencing auditory hallucinations or paranoid episodes. I was the victim of an elaborate psychological attack, and now I had proof. David's footsteps on the stairs meant I had only moments to compose myself, to slip back into the role of the confused and dependent wife he expected me to be. But inside, my mind was already working, already planning, already thinking about how to turn his own weapons against him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his usual bright smile, hair still damp from the shower, looking like the successful and attractive man I had fallen in love with 7 years ago. He was wearing the blue dress shirt I had bought him for his birthday, the one that brought out his eyes and made him look trustworthy and professional. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, moving to kiss my cheek with practiced affection. "You're up early. Everything okay?" I had to force myself not to flinch at his touch, not to let my newfound knowledge show in my expression. "Just couldn't sleep," I said, proud of how normal my voice sounded. "I kept thinking about the appointment on Tuesday. I'm nervous." David's face shifted into the expression of gentle concern that I now recognized as a carefully rehearsed performance. "Hey, it's gonna be fine," he said, taking my hands in his. "Dr. Williams is gonna help us figure out what's going on, and then we can start working on getting you better. I know it's scary, but you're so brave for taking this step." The words that had once comforted me now felt like acid in my ears. Every reassurance was manipulation. Every expression of love was part of the trap. But I nodded and managed a small smile, letting him pull me into a hug that made my skin crawl. "I hate that I have to leave for Atlanta today," he continued, and I could hear the false regret in his voice. "I tried to reschedule the conference, but this client has been planning this presentation for months. I'll be back Monday night, plenty of time to be there for your appointment." I knew from the messages that David was eager to be away for a few days, giving Ashley and him more time to finalize their plans without worrying about my suspicious behavior. The conference was real, but his priorities weren't what he was pretending them to be. "It's okay," I said into his shoulder. "The break might be good for me. Maybe I can rest and clear my head before Tuesday." "That's exactly what you should do," David said, pulling back to look at me with those concerned eyes. "Maybe call your sister if you start feeling anxious. Jennifer always knows how to calm you down. My sister Jennifer. I wondered how many of our conversations David had been monitoring, how much of my support system he had been quietly undermining. Jennifer was a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital, and she had been increasingly worried about my apparent mental health decline. David had been encouraging me to lean on her for support, which I now realized was part of his strategy to create witnesses to my psychological deterioration. "I'll think about it," I said. "You should get ready for your flight." David kissed my forehead and moved toward the coffee maker, completely unaware that his phone had betrayed everything. He chatted casually about his travel plans and the clients he would be meeting, maintaining the performance of a successful husband balancing work demands with concern for his troubled wife. I watched him pour his coffee into the travel mug I had given him last Christmas, the one engraved with "World's Best Husband," that now felt like a cruel joke. He gathered his luggage and briefcase, checking his phone one more time before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "I'll call you when I land," he said, giving me one final kiss goodbye. "And Emma, please don't worry too much about Tuesday. Whatever Dr. Williams finds, we'll handle it together. I love you." "I love you too," I managed to say, the words feeling foreign and bitter in my mouth. After his car pulled out of our driveway, I remained standing at the kitchen window for several minutes, processing everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. The woman who had woken up this morning was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the game being played against her. But understanding the game was only the first step. Now I had to figure out how to win it. I had 5 days until the psychiatric evaluation that was supposed to be the final nail in my coffin. 5 days to gather evidence, build a defense, and turn David's elaborate plan against him. 5 days to save my sanity, my freedom, and my future. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's own arrogance had provided me with the tools I needed. His text messages were detailed documentation of a criminal conspiracy. His methods were now exposed, which meant I could counter them. His timeline gave me a narrow window of opportunity, but it was enough. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like myself again. Not the confused, paranoid, forgetful woman David had been systematically creating, but Emma Richardson, the sharp marketing professional who had built a successful career by outthinking her competition. The woman who had inherited not just money from her grandmother, but also her fierce intelligence and unbreakable will. David had made the mistake of underestimating me, assuming that his psychological manipulation had broken me completely. He had no idea that discovering his betrayal hadn't shattered me further, but had actually restored me to my full strength. As I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the home he was planning to steal and the life he was trying to destroy, I began to plan my counterattack. Dr. Patricia Williams was expecting to evaluate a mentally deteriorating woman who needed immediate intervention. Instead, she was going to meet someone very different. Someone who had evidence. Someone who had been pushed too far. Someone who was ready to fight back. The appointment on Tuesday was still going to be the turning point David expected. Just not in the way he had planned. The silence in our Myers Park home felt different now that David was gone. For 18 months I had dreaded being alone, afraid of the strange sounds and confused thoughts that seemed to plague me when he wasn't there to provide stability. Now I understood that those fears had been manufactured, and the silence felt like freedom. I spent the first day after David's departure doing something I hadn't done in over a year, trusting my own instincts completely. I started by methodically searching our house for evidence of his manipulation campaign, and what I found exceeded even my worst expectations. In the basement storage room, hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, I discovered a small electronic device that looked like a modified baby monitor. When I examined it more closely, I realized it was the source of the mysterious whispers I had been hearing at night. David had been using it to broadcast faint sounds through our home's ventilation system, sounds that were just barely audible and designed to make me question whether I was hearing things. The device was connected to a timer system that would activate it at random intervals during the night, ensuring that the sounds seemed unpredictable and therefore more likely to be dismissed as hallucinations. There was even a small speaker hidden in the wall behind our bedroom headboard, so cleverly concealed that I never would have found it if I hadn't known to look. In David's home office, I found a folder labeled Project Files that contained detailed documentation of his manipulation campaign. He had kept meticulous records of every incident, every planted doubt, every manufactured confusion. The folder contained a timeline of my supposed psychological decline, complete with dates, methods used, and my reactions to each manipulation. One section was titled Memory Disruption Techniques and included strategies for making me doubt my recollections of conversations and events. David had been recording our interactions with a small digital recorder, then editing the recordings to change key details before playing them back to me later. When I expressed confusion about these altered conversations, he would act concerned about my memory and suggest that I might be misremembering things due to stress. Another section detailed environmental gaslighting methods. This included moving my personal items to different locations, changing temperature settings in the house and then denying it when I noticed, and subtly rearranging furniture so that I would bump into things and feel disoriented in my own home. He had even been adding small amounts of sleep medication to my evening tea, not enough to make me unconscious, but enough to make me groggy and more susceptible to confusion. The most chilling section was labeled Isolation Strategies. David had been systematically undermining my relationships with friends and family, not through obvious sabotage but through subtle manipulation. He would share carefully edited versions of my confused behavior with my sister Jennifer, expressing concern about my mental state while positioning himself as the patient, loving husband trying to help his struggling wife. He had been intercepting some of my text messages and emails, responding to friends and family in ways that made me seem unreliable or antisocial. When people stopped reaching out as frequently, David would comfort me about my apparent social isolation while secretly being the cause of it. I found copies of emails David had sent to Dr. Patricia Williams before scheduling my appointment. In these messages, he presented himself as a desperate husband, seeking help for his wife's deteriorating mental condition. He described episodes of paranoia, memory loss, and erratic behavior, many of which were either completely fabricated or were actually my natural reactions to his deliberate manipulation. Most damaging was a series of photographs David had taken of the journal entries he had planted in my belongings. He had photographed pages of handwriting that looked convincingly like mine but contained disturbing, paranoid thoughts that I would never have written. These photos were included in his communications with Dr. Williams as evidence of my psychological decline. Reading these files, I began to understand the true scope of David's planning. This wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by his affair with Ashley. This was a calculated long-term strategy that had been in development for over 2 years, coinciding with my grandmother's death and my inheritance of her substantial estate. David had been researching psychological manipulation techniques, studying gaslighting methods, and consulting with Ashley about the most effective ways to undermine someone's sense of reality. Ashley's background in psychology hadn't been a coincidence. David had specifically cultivated their relationship because of her knowledge in this area. I photographed every document in the folder with my phone, creating a comprehensive record of David's manipulation campaign. Then I carefully returned everything to its original position, ensuring that he would have no reason to suspect I had discovered his files. The next phase of my preparation involved understanding exactly what I was facing with Dr. Williams. I spent hours researching her background, her approach to psychological evaluation, and the specific tests and assessments she was likely to use during our session. Dr. Patricia Williams was a respected clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience, specializing in anxiety disorders and psychological trauma. More importantly, I learned that Dr. Williams had written several papers about the psychological effects of domestic abuse and manipulation. She was considered an expert in recognizing the signs of gaslighting and other forms of psychological control. This knowledge gave me hope that she might be more receptive to the truth than David realized. I also researched the legal implications of psychiatric evaluations in North Carolina. I discovered that for someone to be declared mentally incompetent, the evidence had to be overwhelming, and the evaluation had to follow specific protocols. David's plan relied heavily on Dr. Williams providing a diagnosis that would support his petition for guardianship, but I learned that ethical psychologists were extremely careful about such determinations. Armed with this knowledge, I began planning my approach for the evaluation. I needed to present clear, coherent evidence of David's manipulation, while demonstrating my own mental stability and competence. This meant I couldn't simply tell Dr. Williams what had happened. I needed to show her proof that would be impossible to dismiss. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive documentation package. I printed copies of all the text messages between David and Ashley, organized the photos I had taken of David's manipulation files, and created a detailed timeline of incidents that I could now recognize as deliberate gaslighting attempts. I also wrote a clear, factual account of my discovery of David's plan, focusing on specific evidence rather than emotional reactions. I wanted Dr. Williams to see that I was capable of rational thought and logical analysis, directly contradicting the picture of mental instability that David had been painting. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to ensure that Dr. Williams would actually see this evidence during our session, despite David's efforts to control the narrative. This meant I had to think strategically about how to present my case in a way that couldn't be dismissed as paranoid delusions. On Sunday evening, I called my sister Jennifer using a secure messaging app that I was confident David couldn't monitor. Jennifer was working the night shift at Presbyterian Hospital, and I knew she would have time to talk privately. "Emma, how are you doing?" Jennifer's voice carried the mixture of love and concern that had become familiar over the past months. "David told me you've been having a rough time lately." "Jen, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen to everything before you respond," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I've discovered that David has been deliberately manipulating me to make me think I'm losing my mind." There was a long pause. "Emma, that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure you're thinking clearly about this?" I had expected this reaction. For months, Jennifer had been receiving David's carefully crafted reports about my declining mental state. From her perspective, my claim probably sounded exactly like the paranoid thinking David had been describing. "I have proof," I said. "Text messages, documents, photographs of equipment he's been using." "Jen, I know how this sounds, but I need you to trust me enough to look at the evidence before making a judgment." I spent the next hour walking Jennifer through everything I had discovered, sending her photos of the most damning text messages and documents through the secure app. I watched her responses change from skepticism to concern to outrage as the evidence mounted. "Oh my God, Emma," she finally said. "This is horrific. I can't believe he's been doing this to you." And I helped him without knowing it. Every time he called me worried about your behavior, I encouraged him to get you professional help. "You couldn't have known," I assured her. "He fooled everyone, including me, for 18 months. But now I need your help to make sure this doesn't work." Jennifer's medical background made her an ideal ally. She understood the psychological evaluation process and could provide professional insights about how to present my case most effectively. More importantly, she could serve as a witness to my mental competence during the period when David claimed I was deteriorating. "What do you need me to do?" Jennifer asked. "I need you to document our conversation tonight," I said. "Write down everything we discussed, including your professional assessment of my mental state during this call. If necessary, I may need you to testify about my competence and the coherence of my evidence." We spent another hour developing a strategy for the evaluation. Jennifer helped me understand what Dr. Williams would be looking for in terms of mental status indicators, and how to present my evidence in the most credible way possible. "The key is to stay calm and factual," Jennifer advised. "Let the evidence speak for itself. Don't get emotional or defensive, even if Dr. Williams seems skeptical at first. Your documentation is so thorough that any competent psychologist will recognize the truth." The next morning, I made an appointment with Michael Chen, a family law attorney whose office was located in downtown Charlotte. I had chosen him specifically because of his reputation for handling complex domestic abuse cases and his experience with psychological manipulation in divorce proceedings. Michael's office was in a modern building overlooking the city, and his professional demeanor immediately put me at ease. He was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 40s, with an alert intelligence that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with complicated situations. "Mrs. Richardson, what can I help you with today?" he asked, after his assistant had brought us coffee and closed the door for privacy. I presented him with the same documentation package I had prepared for Dr. Williams, watching his expression change as he reviewed the text messages and manipulation files. Michael asked detailed questions about the timeline of events, the methods David had used, and the potential legal implications of the psychiatric evaluation. "This is one of the most systematic gaslighting campaigns I've ever encountered," Michael said after reviewing everything. Your husband and his accomplice have essentially been conducting psychological warfare against you. The good news is that their own documentation provides overwhelming evidence of their criminal activity. Criminal activity? I asked. Absolutely. What you're describing involves fraud, conspiracy, unlawful medication of another person, invasion of privacy, and potentially attempted conservatorship abuse. These are serious felonies, not just grounds for divorce. Michael explained that my situation was more than just a marriage falling apart. It was a criminal conspiracy to steal my assets through psychological abuse. The text messages between David and Ashley constituted evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, and the documentation of their manipulation methods could support charges of psychological abuse and exploitation of a vulnerable person. However, Michael cautioned, the timing is critical. If David succeeds in getting you declared mentally incompetent, it becomes much harder to pursue these charges. The courts tend to be skeptical of accusations made by someone who has been professionally diagnosed with severe mental health issues. This made the upcoming evaluation even more crucial. Not only was it about protecting my freedom and assets, but it was also about preserving my legal standing to pursue justice against David and Ashley. Michael and I spent the rest of our meeting developing a comprehensive legal strategy. He would prepare documentation to file immediately after the evaluation, assuming it went in my favor. If Dr. Williams determined that I was mentally competent, Michael would move quickly to freeze our joint assets, file for divorce, and pursue criminal charges against both David and Ashley. I want to be clear about something, Michael said as our meeting concluded. Based on the evidence you've shown me, I believe you're going to be fine in this evaluation. Dr. Williams has a strong reputation for recognizing manipulation and abuse. Your documentation is thorough. Your presentation is coherent, and your mental state appears completely normal. Leaving Michael's office, I felt more confident than I had in months. I had allies who believed me, evidence that was impossible to dismiss, and a clear plan for moving forward. But I also knew that the most critical moment was still ahead of me. David would be returning from Atlanta on Monday evening, which meant I had one more day to complete my preparations. I used that time to create backup copies of all my evidence, storing them in multiple locations, including a safety deposit box at a bank David didn't know about. I also took care of practical matters that would be important regardless of how the evaluation went. I opened a separate bank account and transferred funds that I could document as coming from my inheritance rather than our joint income. I changed the passwords on all my personal accounts and enabled two-factor authentication to prevent David from accessing my communications. Most importantly, I prepared myself mentally for what would happen when David returned. I needed to maintain the appearance of being the confused, anxious woman he expected, while internally staying focused on my strategy for Tuesday's appointment. Monday evening arrived with deceptive normalcy. David returned from his conference full of stories about successful client meetings and promising business prospects. He asked about my weekend with the same gentle concern he had been showing for months, and I responded with the appropriate mixture of anxiety and gratitude for his support. "I'm nervous about tomorrow," I told him as we prepared for bed. "What if Dr. Williams thinks there's something seriously wrong with me?" David's response was perfectly calibrated to maintain his caring husband facade while reinforcing my insecurities. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll handle it together," he said, holding me close. "Dr. Williams is there to help us understand what's going on, not to judge you. And no matter what she finds, I'll be right there with you every step of the way." But I had learned from his text messages that David had no intention of accompanying me to the appointment. His plan was to drop me off at Dr. Williams's office and then leave, claiming he had an urgent client emergency. This would serve two purposes. It would prevent him from having to maintain his performance during the evaluation, and it would make me appear more isolated and dependent. The irony was that David's plan to abandon me at the appointment was actually going to work in my favor. Without him there to monitor my responses or try to control the narrative, I would have complete freedom to present my evidence and tell my story without interference. As we lay in bed that night, David holding me with practiced tenderness while planning my destruction, I felt a calm certainty that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. Not in the way David expected, but in the way justice demanded. Dr. Patricia Williams was expecting to evaluate a woman on the edge of psychological collapse. Instead, she was going to meet someone who had gathered overwhelming evidence of the most systematic manipulation campaign she had likely ever encountered. The appointment that was supposed to be my downfall was going to become David's instead. And unlike his victims, he would have no idea what was coming until it was far too late to stop it. Tomorrow would be the day I reclaimed my sanity, my truth, and my life. The day David Richardson learned that he had seriously underestimated the woman he had spent 18 months trying to destroy. The day his perfect plan became his perfect downfall. Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear in Charlotte, the kind of autumn day that normally would have filled me with optimism. I woke at 6, an hour before my alarm, my body humming with focused energy rather than the anxiety I had been performing for David. For the first time in 18 months, I felt completely present in my own mind, every thought sharp and purposeful. David was already awake beside me, checking his phone with the casual air of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as intended. He had no idea that the woman lying next to him was no longer the confused, malleable victim he thought he had created. "How are you feeling about today?" he asked, setting his phone aside and turning to me with that expression of gentle concern I now recognized as completely manufactured. "Scared," I said, which was partially true. I was scared, but not for the reasons he assumed. What if she thinks I'm really losing my mind? David's hand found mine under the covers, his touch warm and reassuring in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hey, whatever Dr. Williams finds, it's gonna help us understand what's happening. Knowledge is power, right? Once we know what we're dealing with, we can start working on getting you better." The word better coming from his lips felt like poison. Better for whom? Better for his plan to steal my inheritance and destroy my life? I managed to squeeze his hand and smile weakly, maintaining the performance that had kept me safe for the past few days. "I just wish you could stay with me during the appointment," I said, knowing exactly what his response would be. David's face shifted into an expression of genuine regret that would have been Oscar-worthy if I hadn't known it was complete theater. "I know, sweetheart. I tried to reschedule the Morrison meeting, but they're flying in from New York specifically for this presentation. The timing is just terrible." The Morrison meeting was real, according to David's calendar, but his priorities weren't what he was pretending. The text messages I had discovered revealed that he specifically wanted to avoid being present during the evaluation. His plan required him to be absent when Dr. Williams supposedly confirmed his wife's mental instability. "I understand," I said. "Your work is important too." We went through our morning routine with practiced normalcy. David made coffee while I showered, and I prepared breakfast while he got dressed in his most expensive suit, the one that made him look successful and trustworthy. Every movement felt choreographed, a careful dance of deception that only one of us knew we were performing. During breakfast, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled in a way that made my stomach turn, though I kept my expression neutral. I was certain it was from Ashley, probably wishing him luck with the final phase of their plan. "That was Jake from the office," David said, which I knew was a lie. "He's confirming the details for this afternoon's presentation." The drive to Dr. Williams's office in Ballantyne took 20 minutes through Charlotte's morning traffic. David kept the conversation light, pointing out changes in the neighborhoods we passed and commenting on the beautiful fall weather. To anyone observing, we looked like a caring husband taking his troubled wife to an important medical appointment. Dr. Williams's office was located in a modern professional building, surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping, the kind of place that suggested competence and discretion, exactly what someone would want in a mental health professional. David parked near the entrance and turned to me with an expression of loving support. "You're gonna do great in there," he said, reaching over to take my hand. "Just be honest with Dr. Williams about everything you've been experiencing. Don't try to minimize anything or make yourself seem better than you feel. She needs to understand the full picture to help you." The irony was staggering. David was encouraging me to be completely honest, having no idea that honesty was exactly what would destroy his elaborate scheme. "What time should I expect you back?" I asked. "The Morrison meeting should wrap up by noon, so I'll be here to pick you up at 12:30. That should give you plenty of time with Dr. Williams." David leaned over and kissed my cheek. "I love you, Emma. Whatever happens today, we're gonna get through this together." I watched him drive away, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself a genuine smile. David had just abandoned me at what he believed would be my final evaluation as a free woman. Completely confident that his manipulation had been so thorough that I couldn't possibly present a coherent defense of my sanity. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The waiting room of Dr. Williams's office was designed to be calming, with soft lighting, comfortable seating, and peaceful artwork on the walls. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, checked me in and assured me that Dr. Williams would be with me shortly. I used the waiting time to center myself and review my mental outline of how I planned to present my case. The evidence I had gathered was overwhelming, but I needed to present it in a way that demonstrated my rationality and competence, rather than appearing desperate or paranoid. "Emma Richardson?" a voice called from the doorway to the inner offices. Dr. Patricia Williams was a woman in her mid-50s, with graying hair pulled back in a professional style and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple but elegant pantsuit and moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling complex psychological situations. "Good morning, Emma. I'm Dr. Williams. Please come in." Her office was warm and inviting, with bookcases lining 2 walls and comfortable chairs arranged to facilitate conversation rather than formal interview. Dr. Williams gestured for me to take the chair that faced away from the window, a positioning that would allow her to observe my expressions clearly while keeping me comfortable. "Before we begin," Dr. Williams said, settling into her chair with a notepad and pen, "I want you to know that everything we discuss today is confidential. This evaluation is about understanding your current mental state and determining what kind of support might be helpful for you." I nodded, studying her face carefully. Based on my research, Dr. Williams had a reputation for being thorough and fair, but I also knew that David had been laying groundwork for months to influence her perception of my mental state. "Your husband has expressed significant concern about some changes he's observed in your behavior over the past year," Dr. Williams continued. "Memory issues, episodes of confusion, hearing sounds that others don't notice. Can you tell me about your experience with these incidents?" This was the moment I had been preparing for. I could respond as the confused, uncertain woman David expected me to be, or I could begin presenting the truth with the evidence to support it. "Dr. Williams," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "before I answer that question, I need to tell you something important. Everything my husband has told you about my mental state is part of an elaborate deception designed to make me appear mentally incompetent so he can gain control of my financial assets." Dr. Williams's pen paused over her notepad, and her eyebrows rose slightly. In her experience, she had probably heard many accusations and conspiracy theories from patients who were genuinely struggling with mental health issues. My claim would naturally sound suspicious. "That's a very serious allegation," she said carefully. "What makes you believe this is the case?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder containing printed copies of the most damning evidence I had discovered. "Because I have documentation of his plan, including text messages between him and his accomplice detailing their methods and timeline." I handed her the first set of documents, printed screenshots of David's text conversation with Ashley. Dr. Williams accepted them with professional curiosity, but I could see skepticism in her expression as she began to read. That skepticism changed rapidly as she absorbed the content of the messages. Her eyebrows drew together in concentration, and she looked up at me with sharp attention. "These appear to be text messages between your husband and someone named Ashley," she said. "They're discussing techniques for making you doubt your memory and perception." "Ashley Morgan is a coworker of my husband's," I explained. "She has a background in psychology, and according to those messages, she's been advising him on the most effective ways to undermine my sense of reality." Dr. Williams continued reading, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she reached the messages discussing my upcoming appointment with her, she set the papers down and looked at me with new assessment. "According to these texts, your husband has been providing me with false information about your mental state, including fabricated evidence of psychological deterioration." "Yes," I said. "I have additional documentation of his methods, including photos of equipment he's been using to create sounds in our house, and files where he kept detailed records of his manipulation campaign." I handed her the next set of documents, photos of the electronic devices I had found, copies of David's manipulation files, and the timeline he had created documenting my supposed psychological decline. Dr. Williams reviewed each piece of evidence with the careful attention of a professional who understood the implications of what she was seeing. The manipulation files were particularly compelling because they showed David's systematic approach and his detailed knowledge of psychological pressure techniques. Emma, Dr. Williams said after reviewing everything, "What you're showing me suggests an extremely sophisticated campaign of psychological abuse. These methods demonstrate advanced knowledge of gaslighting techniques and systematic manipulation strategies." "I've been living with the effects of this campaign for 18 months, I said. "Until I discovered those text messages 4 days ago, I genuinely believed I was losing my mind. Every symptom my husband reported to you was either fabricated or was my natural response to his deliberate manipulation." Dr. Williams set the documents aside and leaned forward slightly. "I need to ask you some direct questions about your current mental state. Based on what you've shown me, I'm already seeing significant inconsistencies with the picture your husband painted, but I want to conduct a proper assessment." For the next hour, Dr. Williams put me through a comprehensive mental status evaluation. She tested my memory, reasoning ability, perception, and emotional regulation. She asked about my understanding of the situation, my plans for addressing it, and my support systems. Throughout the evaluation, I felt a growing sense of vindication. Every test confirmed what I had known deep down but had been trained to doubt. My mind was completely clear. My reasoning was sound, and my responses were entirely appropriate for someone who had discovered an elaborate conspiracy against them. "Emma," Dr. Williams said as she completed her assessment, "I want to be very clear about my findings. You are showing no signs of the psychological deterioration your husband described. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is logical, your emotional responses are appropriate, and your presentation is completely coherent." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming. For 18 months, I had been questioning my own sanity, wondering if my perceptions could be trusted, doubting my ability to navigate the world independently. Having a mental health professional confirm my competence felt like being handed back my own identity. "More importantly," Dr. Williams continued, "the evidence you've presented suggests that you've been the victim of an extremely serious form of psychological abuse. What your husband has been doing goes far beyond typical domestic manipulation. This appears to be a calculated attempt to undermine your mental health for financial gain." "What happens now?" I asked. Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the professional and legal implications of what she had learned. "Several things need to happen immediately. First, I'm going to document my findings in a comprehensive report that contradicts everything your husband told me about your mental state. Second, I'm required to report suspected abuse to the appropriate authorities." She paused and looked at me seriously. "Emma, what you've experienced isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. Your husband and his accomplice have committed multiple felonies, including conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful administration of substances, and psychological abuse with intent to exploit a vulnerable person." The full weight of David's crimes was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about a failing marriage or even a theft attempt. David had been systematically destroying my psychological well-being as part of a criminal conspiracy. "I've already consulted with an attorney," I said, "Michael Chen downtown. He's preparing to file charges as soon as this evaluation is complete." "Good," Dr. Williams said. "You're going to need strong legal representation. I'll be happy to provide expert testimony about the psychological effects of the manipulation you've endured and my professional assessment of your mental competence." We spent another 30 minutes discussing next steps and resources for recovery from psychological abuse. Dr. Williams explained that while I showed no signs of mental illness, I would likely benefit from therapy to process the trauma of David's manipulation campaign. "It's important to understand that your emotional responses to discovering this betrayal are completely normal," she said. "Anger, hurt, confusion about what was real and what wasn't. These are natural reactions to systematic psychological abuse." As our session neared its end, Dr. Williams made notes in my file that would serve as official documentation of David's deception and my mental competence. This report would be crucial for the legal proceedings that were about to unfold. "Emma, I want you to know that you've shown remarkable strength in gathering this evidence and presenting it so clearly, Dr. Williams said. Many victims of psychological manipulation are so damaged by the experience that they struggle to advocate for themselves effectively. Your response has been extraordinary. At exactly 12:15, I heard a familiar voice in the waiting room. David had arrived to collect what he assumed would be a broken woman with a fresh diagnosis of mental instability. Instead, he was about to encounter something entirely different. Dr. Williams and I agreed that she would speak with David before I came out, giving her an opportunity to observe his behavior when he thought his plan had succeeded. I waited in her office while she went to greet him. Through the partially open door, I could hear their conversation in the waiting room. "Mr. Richardson, thank you for coming," Dr. Williams said in a neutral professional tone. "I've completed my evaluation of your wife. How did it go?" David asked, and I could hear the carefully modulated concern in his voice. "Was I right to be worried about her condition? I'd like to discuss my findings with you privately before Emma joins us," Dr. Williams said. "Could you step into my office for a moment?" I moved to the chair facing the door so I could observe David's reaction when Dr. Williams delivered her verdict. He entered the office looking confident and appropriately concerned, exactly the performance he had been planning. "Please, have a seat," Dr. Williams said, closing the door behind him. David settled into the chair I had occupied earlier, his body language relaxed and expectant. He was clearly anticipating validation of everything he had told Dr. Williams about my deteriorating mental state. "Mr. Richardson," Dr. Williams began, her voice taking on a much more formal tone, "I have some very serious concerns about the information you provided regarding your wife's mental health." David's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his features. "I don't understand. Are you saying she's worse than I thought?" "I'm saying that everything you told me about Emma's psychological condition appears to be fabricated," Dr. Williams said directly. "Your wife has presented me with overwhelming evidence that you have been systematically manipulating her perception of reality as part of what appears to be a criminal conspiracy." The change in David's face was immediate and dramatic. The mask of concerned husband fell away completely, replaced by genuine shock and what looked like the beginning of panic. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair. I don't know what she's told you, but Emma has been having serious problems with paranoia and false beliefs," David stammered. "She's been imagining conspiracies and making accusations that aren't based in reality." "Mr. Richardson," Dr. Williams said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with manipulation before, "your wife has provided me with text messages between you and Ashley Morgan, documenting your plan to have her declared mentally incompetent. She has photographs of equipment you've been using to create auditory illusions in your home. She has copies of files where you documented your manipulation techniques." David's face went completely pale. For a moment, he looked like he might be sick. Then his expression hardened into something I had never seen before, a cold calculation that revealed the man who had been hiding behind 18 months of false concern. "Those text messages could be fabricated," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Emma is intelligent enough to create fake evidence to support her delusions. The evidence is quite extensive and internally consistent," Dr. Williams replied. "More importantly, my evaluation of Emma shows no signs of the psychological deterioration you described. She demonstrates excellent memory, clear reasoning, appropriate emotional responses, and complete mental competence." The room fell silent as David processed the complete failure of his plan. Everything he had worked toward for months had not only failed but had created documented evidence of his criminal activity. "I'd like to speak with my wife now," David said finally, clearly trying to regain some control over the situation. "Of course," Dr. Williams said, "but I should inform you that I'm required to report suspected psychological abuse to the appropriate authorities. The evidence Emma has presented suggests multiple criminal violations." David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, fear, and finally, a desperate attempt to return to his concerned husband persona. But the mask no longer fit. Dr. Williams had seen through his deception completely. When I joined them in the office, David looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Gone was any pretense of love or concern. In its place was raw hatred, mixed with disbelief that his carefully constructed plan had been turned against him. "Emma," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "what lies have you been telling Dr. Williams?" "I showed her the truth," I said calmly. "The text messages between you and Ashley, the manipulation files you kept, the equipment you used to make me think I was hearing things, all of it." David's composure cracked entirely. "You went through my private communications? You invaded my privacy?" The irony of his accusation after 18 months of psychological invasion was breathtaking. Dr. Williams intervened before I could respond. "Mr. Richardson, your wife has uncovered evidence of serious criminal activity. Her actions were those of someone defending herself against ongoing psychological assault." "This is insane," David said, standing abruptly. "Emma, we're leaving. You obviously can't trust anything Dr. Williams says if she's encouraging these paranoid fantasies." "Actually," I said, remaining seated, "I won't be leaving with you. Dr. Williams has confirmed that I'm mentally competent to make my own decisions, and I've decided that I don't want to continue living with someone who has been systematically trying to destroy my sanity." The full realization of his situation finally hit David. Not only had his plan failed, but he now faced criminal charges, the loss of his marriage, and the destruction of his career. Ashley would likely face the same consequences, meaning he had lost everything he thought he was gaining. "You can't prove any of this," David said desperately. "Those messages could be taken out of context. The other evidence is circumstantial." "Mr. Richardson," Dr. Williams said firmly, "I suggest you contact an attorney immediately. The evidence Mrs. Richardson has presented is quite compelling, and my professional assessment contradicts everything you told me about her mental state." David looked between Dr. Williams and me, finally understanding that he had been completely outmaneuvered. The woman he thought he had broken had instead broken his entire scheme while he was attending a conference, confident in his success. "Emma," he said, his voice now pleading, "we can work this out. If you're upset about Ashley, we can fix that. But this is going too far." 18 months of psychological torture was going too far, I replied. "What's happening now is justice." David stormed out of the office, leaving me alone with Dr. Williams and the wreckage of his elaborate plan. Through the window, I watched him get into his car and drive away, probably to call Ashley and warn her that their scheme had been completely exposed. But it was too late for damage control. The evidence was documented, the professional assessment was complete, and the legal machinery was already in motion. Dr. Williams and I spent a few more minutes completing the necessary paperwork and ensuring that her report would be available for the criminal proceedings. She also provided me with referrals for therapists who specialized in recovery from psychological abuse. As I left her office that afternoon, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in over a year. The woman who had entered that morning, still carrying the doubt and confusion David had planted, was gone. In her place was someone who had reclaimed her truth, her strength, and her future. David had intended for this appointment to be the final step in my destruction. Instead, it had become the first step in his. The autumn afternoon sun felt different on my face as I walked out of Dr. Williams's building. For 18 months, I had moved through the world with the tentative steps of someone who couldn't trust her own perceptions. Now I walked with the confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her truth and was ready to act on it. My first call was to Michael Chen. I reached him as I sat in my car in the parking lot, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Emma, how did the evaluation go?" Michael's voice carried the cautious optimism of an attorney who had seen too many cases go wrong at critical moments. "Better than we could have hoped," I said. "Dr. Williams confirmed that I'm completely mentally competent and that David's claims were fabricated. She's filing a report documenting psychological abuse and criminal manipulation. We have everything we need to move forward." The relief in Michael's voice was audible. "Excellent. Can you come to my office immediately? We need to act quickly while David is still reacting to the situation rather than planning his next move." Within 30 minutes, I was back in Michael's downtown office, this time carrying Dr. Williams's preliminary report along with my existing documentation. Michael had used the time to prepare emergency motions and contact the appropriate law enforcement agencies. The first priority is protecting your assets, Michael explained as we reviewed the legal strategy. David's plan was to gain control of your inheritance through guardianship, which means he's probably already taken preliminary steps to access joint accounts or prepare for asset transfer. Michael had anticipated this possibility and had spent the morning preparing emergency financial protections. We immediately filed a motion to freeze all joint accounts and prevent any major financial transactions without court approval. This would stop David from attempting to hide or liquidate assets before the criminal investigation could proceed. Second, we need to ensure Ashley Morgan can't destroy evidence, Michael continued. Her text messages with David constitute a confession to criminal conspiracy. We're requesting that law enforcement secure her phone and computer records before she has a chance to delete anything. The speed with which everything was moving felt surreal after 18 months of gradual psychological erosion. David's careful, methodical approach had been designed to avoid detection and prevent rapid response. Instead, his own documentation had given us everything we needed to dismantle his scheme in a matter of hours. Michael's assistant brought in copies of the paperwork we would be filing with the court and the criminal complaints we were submitting to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. The charges against David were extensive: conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful administration of controlled substances, invasion of privacy, psychological abuse with intent to exploit, and attempted theft by deception. Ashley would face similar charges as a co-conspirator, with additional allegations related to her professional misconduct. Her background in psychology made her participation in the manipulation campaign particularly egregious from a legal standpoint. "What's our timeline?" I asked. "The emergency motions will be heard tomorrow morning," Michael said. "The criminal investigation will begin immediately, probably with arrests by the end of the week. David's going to find himself facing felony charges before he has time to construct a defense." As we completed the legal filings, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I looked at Michael questioningly. "Answer it," he advised. "But put it on speaker." His reaction to the situation could provide additional evidence of his guilt. David's voice when I answered was tight, with barely controlled anger. "Emma, we need to talk. Where are you?" "I'm handling some business matters," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What business matters?" "Emma, Dr. Williams called me back into her office and made some very serious accusations. She's claiming that you've fabricated evidence against me." The lie was so blatant that Michael raised his eyebrows. Dr. Williams had done no such thing, of course. David was trying to manipulate the situation even now, hoping to convince me that the evidence I had presented was somehow being questioned. "David, Dr. Williams confirmed that I'm mentally competent and that your claims about my psychological condition were false," I said. "She also confirmed that the evidence I showed her documents a criminal conspiracy." There was a long pause before David responded, and when he did, his voice had shifted to the pleading tone he used when his other manipulation tactics failed. "Emma, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If I've done anything that seemed manipulative, it wasn't intentional. I've been trying to help you, and maybe I went about it the wrong way." Michael was taking notes, documenting David's attempt to minimize his actions and claim ignorance of their impact. This conversation would become part of the evidence against him. "David, I have copies of your text messages with Ashley discussing your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. I have photos of the equipment you used to create sounds in our house. I have your own files documenting your manipulation techniques. There's no misunderstanding." The silence that followed was longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice carried a desperation I had never heard from him before. "Emma, if you pursue this, you're going to destroy both our lives. Think about what this will do to your reputation, to your career. People will always wonder if you really were having mental health problems. Is that what you want?" The threat was clear. David was trying to use my own fears about stigma and professional consequences to prevent me from seeking justice. It was a final attempt at manipulation, playing on concerns that might have worked 18 months ago. "What I want is for you to face the consequences of what you've done to me," I replied. "I'm not afraid of people knowing the truth about psychological abuse. The only person whose reputation should be destroyed is yours." David's composure finally cracked completely. You're making a huge mistake, Emma. I'll fight this. I'll prove that you're unstable and that you've fabricated this evidence. No one will believe you over me. David, I said calmly. Dr. Williams already believes me. My attorney believes me. And soon, a judge and jury will believe me. Your threats don't work on someone who isn't afraid anymore. I ended the call and looked at Michael, who was finishing his notes with a satisfied expression. That was perfect, he said. He just provided us with evidence of witness intimidation and threats of retaliation. Plus, his claim that he'll prove you fabricated evidence shows consciousness of guilt. An innocent person would be focused on clearing their name, not on attacking their accuser. The rest of the afternoon was spent filing documents and coordinating with law enforcement. Detective Sarah Rodriguez from the CMPD's Special Victims Unit was assigned to the case, and she reviewed our evidence with the thorough attention of someone experienced in complex psychological abuse cases. This is one of the most systematic manipulation campaigns I've encountered, Detective Rodriguez said, after reviewing the text messages and Dr. Williams' report. The level of planning and the deliberate nature of the psychological attacks make this a very serious criminal matter. Detective Rodriguez explained that she would be coordinating with the district attorney's office to prepare charges, and that search warrants would be executed to secure additional evidence from David and Ashley's electronic devices and workplaces. We'll also be interviewing potential witnesses who may have observed the effects of the manipulation campaign, she said. Your sister, your co-workers, anyone who David told about your supposed mental health problems. The thought of Jennifer and others learning the full extent of what had been done to me was both embarrassing and liberating. I had spent months feeling ashamed of my apparent psychological problems, when in reality I should have been proud of surviving such an elaborate assault on my sanity. By late afternoon, the legal machinery was fully in motion. Emergency protective orders were in place to prevent David from contacting me or accessing our joint assets. Criminal complaints had been filed with detailed evidence supporting multiple felony charges. Dr. Williams had submitted her report documenting the psychological abuse and confirming my mental competence. Michael drove me home to collect some personal belongings, as we had agreed that I shouldn't stay in the house while David had access to it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was taking precautions against the man who had spent months trying to convince me I needed protection from my own mind. The house felt different now that I understood what had been happening within its walls. The basement room where David had hidden his audio equipment, the bedroom where he had secretly drugged my tea, the kitchen where he had performed his caring husband act while planning my destruction. All of these spaces held new meaning. I packed quickly, taking important documents, photographs, and personal items that had sentimental value. As I moved through rooms that had been the site of systematic psychological warfare, I felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. Anger at the violation of what should have been my safe space, but relief that I would never have to pretend to be confused or frightened in this house again. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emma, this is Ashley. We need to talk. David told me about the accusations you're making. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I showed the message to Michael, who was helping me carry boxes to my car. Don't respond, he advised. She's trying to control the narrative before law enforcement contacts her. Her attempt to reach out shows she knows she's in serious trouble. Within minutes, another text arrived. Emma, I never meant for you to be hurt. If my conversations with David seemed inappropriate, it was just venting about work stress. Please call me before this goes any further. The messages revealed Ashley's panic as she realized the evidence against her was substantial. Her attempt to recharacterize months of detailed planning as mere venting showed the desperation of someone who understood that her life was about to change dramatically. Michael documented the messages as additional evidence of the conspiracy and consciousness of guilt. She's trying to minimize her involvement and create plausible deniability, he explained. But the text messages you discovered show detailed planning and active participation in psychological manipulation. These new messages actually make things worse for her. As we finished loading my belongings, my sister Jennifer arrived to help with the transition. I had called her earlier to explain what had happened at Dr. Williams's office, and she had immediately offered to help with whatever I needed. Emma, I can't believe what David did to you, Jennifer said as she hugged me. And I can't believe I helped him without knowing it. Every time he called me worried about your behavior, I encouraged him to get you professional help. You couldn't have known, I assured her. His performance was incredibly convincing. Even I believed him until I saw the evidence. Jennifer's medical background made her particularly angry about the psychological manipulation techniques David had used. What he did isn't just cruel, it's a form of torture, she said. Systematically destroying someone's confidence in their own mind is one of the most devastating things you can do to a person. We drove to Jennifer's house in the university area, where I would be staying while the legal proceedings unfolded. The familiar comfort of my sister's home provided a stark contrast to the psychological minefield my own house had become. That evening, as we sat in Jennifer's living room discussing everything that had happened, my phone rang with a call from Detective Rodriguez. Emma, I wanted to update you on the investigation, she said. We executed search warrants this afternoon at David's workplace and Ashley's apartment. We also secured their phones and computer equipment for forensic analysis. The speed of law enforcement's response was gratifying after months of feeling helpless against David's manipulation. What did you find? Without going into specific details, I can tell you that the evidence supports everything you've reported, Detective Rodriguez said. We found additional documentation of the manipulation campaign, financial records showing David's debts and his research into your inheritance, and communications with Ashley that go back much further than you might have realized. The investigation was revealing that David's interest in manipulating me predated our marriage by several months. He had apparently been researching my financial background and family situation from the very beginning of our relationship, suggesting that his attraction to me had been calculated rather than genuine. We'll be making arrests tomorrow morning, Detective Rodriguez continued. Both David and Ashley will be charged with multiple felonies. The district attorney's office is treating this as a serious case of financial elder abuse and psychological manipulation. After ending the call, I sat with Jennifer processing the reality that David and Ashley would be arrested within hours. The elaborate scheme that had taken them months to construct was being dismantled in less than 24 hours. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from David's brother Ryan. David had apparently reached out to his family for support, probably painting himself as the victim of false accusations by his mentally unstable wife. Emma, Ryan Richardson here. His voice carried the awkward formality of someone who didn't know how to navigate a complex situation. David called me pretty upset about some kind of misunderstanding with you and a therapist. He says you're making accusations that aren't true. Ryan, there's no misunderstanding, I said. David has been systematically manipulating me for 18 months as part of a plan to steal my inheritance. I have extensive evidence, and criminal charges are being filed tomorrow. The silence that followed suggested that Ryan was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. Emma, that doesn't sound like the David the first no. Are you sure you're interpreting things correctly? I'm sure, I said. Your brother documented his manipulation campaign in detailed files. He and Ashley exchanged hundreds of text messages planning my psychological destruction. Dr. Williams confirmed that I'm mentally competent and that David's claims about my condition were fabricated. Jesus, Ryan whispered. Emma, I had no idea. David told us you were having serious mental health problems and that he was trying to get you help. This revelation showed how extensively David had been managing his public image, ensuring that even his family believed his version of events. When his arrest became public, his reputation would be destroyed not just professionally but personally. Ryan, I'm not angry with you for believing him, I said. His deception was very sophisticated. But I want you to know that everything he told you about my mental state was a lie designed to cover his crimes. The conversation with Ryan was another small victory in reclaiming the narrative David had constructed about me. Each person who learned the truth was another step toward complete vindication. Wednesday morning arrived with the news I had been anticipating. Detective Rodriguez called to inform me that both David and Ashley had been arrested at their respective locations and were being charged with multiple felonies. David was arrested at his office, she reported. Ashley was taken into custody at her apartment. Both are being held pending bail hearings. The image of David being arrested at his real estate office, in front of colleagues and clients, provided a satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. His carefully constructed professional image was being destroyed in the most public way possible. What happens next? I asked. The bail hearings will be this afternoon, Detective Rodriguez said. Given the nature of the charges and the evidence against them, we'll be requesting substantial bail amounts. The district attorney's office is also considering additional charges as we analyze the electronic evidence. Michael called shortly after to discuss the bail hearings and our strategy for the civil proceedings. The criminal charges strengthen our position significantly, he explained. We can now file for divorce on grounds of criminal behavior and seek full restitution for the psychological damage and the attempted theft. The speed with which my life was changing felt almost surreal. 2 days ago, I had been preparing for what I thought might be a devastating psychiatric evaluation. Now I was coordinating criminal prosecutions and planning my financial independence from a man who had tried to steal everything from me. Ashley's arrest had additional consequences beyond the criminal charges. Her real estate license was immediately suspended pending investigation by the state licensing board. Her employer, learning of the charges, terminated her employment to avoid association with the scandal. David's situation was even worse. His arrest became public knowledge in Charlotte's real estate community, where reputation was everything. Clients began canceling contracts and demanding new representation. His broker, faced with potential liability issues, suspended his license and distanced the company from the scandal. Jennifer and I watched the local news that evening, where the story was covered as a case of sophisticated financial fraud and psychological abuse. The reporter described it as one of the most elaborate manipulation schemes ever prosecuted in Mecklenburg County. Local authorities say the case highlights the serious criminal nature of psychological abuse and the need for greater awareness of manipulation tactics used to exploit vulnerable individuals, the news anchor reported. Both suspects are facing multiple felony charges and could receive significant prison sentences if convicted. Seeing the story presented as a criminal matter rather than a personal dispute felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. For months, I had internalized David's narrative that my problems were psychological. Now the world was seeing his actions for what they truly were: serious crimes against a victim who had been targeted for her financial assets. The most satisfying moment came when my phone rang with a call from Harrison Webb at Gravora Group, the client whose business I had been working to secure when David was planning my destruction. "Emma, I saw the news about your situation," Harrison said. "I want you to know that our company stands behind you completely. What your husband did is unconscionable, and we're prepared to provide any support you need." The conversation revealed that several of my professional contacts had suspected something was wrong with David's narrative about my mental health. My work had remained consistently excellent even during the period when David claimed I was deteriorating psychologically. "We'd like to offer you a consulting contract directly with Gravora Group," Harrison continued. "Independent of any firm, working directly with our executive team. Your analysis and strategic thinking are exactly what we need." The offer represented more than just financial security. It was professional validation from people who had observed my work during the period when David was trying to convince everyone that I was mentally incompetent. As I ended the call, I realized that David's elaborate scheme had not only failed but had actually improved my situation in ways he never could have anticipated. His attempts to isolate me professionally had instead highlighted my competence to people who mattered. His efforts to make me seem dependent had demonstrated my strength to overcome extraordinary adversity. The man who had spent 18 months trying to destroy my life had instead provided me with the evidence and motivation to build something better than what I had before. His criminal behavior had freed me from a marriage built on deception and positioned me for professional success beyond anything we had achieved together. Justice was being served not just through the criminal proceedings, but through the complete reversal of everything David had tried to accomplish. He had lost his freedom, his career, his reputation, and his future with Ashley. I had gained my independence, my vindication, and opportunities I never would have pursued while trapped in his web of manipulation. The woman who had walked into Dr. Williams's office 2 days ago carrying David's lies about her mental state was gone forever. In her place was someone who had survived the worst kind of psychological assault and emerged stronger, clearer, and more determined than ever before. David Richardson had tried to steal my sanity, my assets, and my future. Instead, his crimes had given me back my life. 8 months later, I stood in the sleek conference room of my new consulting firm, Richardson Strategic Solutions. looking out over Charlotte's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view from the 42nd floor of the Duke Energy Center was breathtaking, but what struck me most was how clear everything appeared. No confusion, no second-guessing, no wondering if my perceptions could be trusted, just crystal-clear awareness of exactly where I was and how I had gotten there. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 weeks earlier with David's sentencing. Judge Margaret Foster had delivered a verdict that exceeded even Michael Chen's expectations. 7 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, psychological abuse with intent to exploit, and multiple counts of identity theft related to his manipulation of my communications and financial records. Ashley Morgan had received 5 years, with additional penalties from the state psychology board that permanently revoked any possibility of her working in mental health or related fields. The judge had been particularly harsh in her assessment of Ashley's participation, noting that her educational background made her manipulation of psychological principles especially egregious. During the sentencing hearing, I had chosen to deliver a victim impact statement that laid out the full scope of what David's campaign had cost me emotionally, professionally, and financially. Standing at the podium in that Mecklenburg County courtroom, speaking directly to the man who had spent 18 months trying to convince me I was losing my mind, felt like the ultimate reclamation of my voice and my truth. "Your Honor," I had said, looking directly at David as he sat at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit, "the defendant didn't just try to steal my money. He tried to steal my sanity, my identity, and my ability to trust my own mind." For 18 months, I lived in a reality he constructed, questioning every thought and perception, apologizing for confusion he deliberately created. David had refused to meet my eyes during the statement, staring down at his hands as I detailed the psychological torture he had inflicted. The confident, charming man who had once manipulated everyone around him looked small and defeated, his carefully constructed facade finally stripped away completely. But what he didn't understand, I had continued, is that his own arrogance would be his downfall. He documented his crimes so meticulously that he provided the evidence for his own conviction. He underestimated the strength of the woman he was trying to destroy. And he learned too late that justice, though sometimes delayed, is inevitable. The courtroom had been packed with reporters, as the case had garnered national attention as an example of sophisticated psychological abuse and financial manipulation. Several major news outlets had covered the story, with legal experts using it as a case study in domestic abuse that went far beyond physical violence. Dr. Patricia Williams had testified as an expert witness during the trial, explaining to the jury how David's manipulation techniques constituted systematic psychological torture designed to undermine my cognitive function and emotional stability. Her testimony had been devastating for the defense, as she methodically explained how each of David's methods was calculated to produce maximum psychological damage. The defendant employed advanced gaslighting techniques that demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of psychological pressure points, Dr. Williams had testified. This wasn't spontaneous abuse arising from relationship conflict. This was a deliberate campaign designed to render the victim unable to advocate for herself or protect her own interests. The prosecution had also presented evidence of David's extensive financial debts and his research into my inheritance, proving that the manipulation campaign was motivated by greed rather than any concern for my well-being. Bank records showed that David owed nearly $200,000 to various creditors, money he had borrowed against anticipated income that never materialized. Ashley's testimony, offered in exchange for a reduced sentence, had provided crucial details about the planning and execution of the scheme. She had described how David had approached her with the idea, how they had researched manipulation techniques together, and how they had celebrated each small victory in undermining my sense of reality. He would text me after particularly successful episodes, Ashley had testified, her voice barely audible as she described their collaboration. Like when Emma would come to work confused about conversations she thought they'd had, or when she would ask me if I thought she was losing her mind. David was proud of how effectively he was breaking her down. The trial had lasted 6 weeks, during which the full extent of David's deception was revealed in excruciating detail. Evidence presented by the prosecution showed that his manipulation had begun even before our marriage, as he researched my family background and financial situation to determine if I would be a suitable target for his scheme. Most shocking was the revelation that David had actually been married once before, to a woman who had died in a car accident after suffering what family members described as a psychological breakdown. Investigators had reopened that case, though no charges were filed due to lack of evidence and the passage of time. During cross-examination, David's attorney had tried to argue that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for my mental health, but the extensive documentation David himself had kept made this defense impossible to maintain. His own files clearly showed calculated planning rather than worried responses to observed behavior. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. When the foreman read the verdict, I felt a sense of vindication that was both deeply personal and universally significant. This wasn't just about my individual case. It was about establishing legal precedent for prosecuting sophisticated psychological abuse. Following the sentencing, media attention had brought opportunities I never could have anticipated. I had been invited to speak at conferences about psychological abuse and financial exploitation, sharing my story with audiences of mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and domestic violence advocates. The Gravora Group contract that had started as David's intended vehicle for my humiliation had become the foundation for my independent consulting practice. Harrison Webb had not only honored the original agreement, but had recommended my services to other major corporations facing similar strategic challenges. Within 6 months of David's arrest, I had built a client base that exceeded anything our joint practice had achieved. Working independently, without David's charming but ultimately superficial client relations, I was able to focus entirely on the analytical work that was my true strength. My new office space in downtown Charlotte reflected this success. Richardson Strategic Solutions occupied an entire floor of premium office space, with a team of 6 analysts and support staff who shared my commitment to thorough, innovative problem-solving. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's attempt to steal my inheritance had actually led to financial success beyond anything I had achieved while married to him. The Gravora project alone had generated fees that exceeded our previous annual income, and referrals from satisfied clients had created a steady stream of high-value engagements. But the professional success, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal transformation I had experienced. The woman who had once apologized for her own thoughts and perceptions had been replaced by someone who trusted her instincts completely and spoke with quiet authority, born from surviving the unthinkable. My relationship with Jennifer had deepened considerably during the months following David's arrest. She had been instrumental in my recovery, providing both emotional support and professional insights that helped me understand the psychological mechanisms David had used against me. The most insidious part of what he did, Jennifer had explained during one of our weekly dinners, was how he made you doubt your own mind. Physical abuse leaves visible marks, but psychological abuse attacks the very foundation of who you are. Jennifer had also connected me with other survivors of psychological abuse, helping me understand that my experience, while extreme in its sophistication, was part of a larger pattern of domestic manipulation that affected thousands of women every year. Through these connections, I had become involved with a local domestic violence organization, providing support and resources for women who were experiencing similar psychological manipulation. My story had become a source of hope for others who felt trapped in relationships where their reality was being systematically undermined. One particularly meaningful encounter had occurred 3 months after David's sentencing, when a young woman named Sarah approached me after a speaking engagement at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. "Mrs. Richardson," she had said, tears in her eyes, "I think my boyfriend is doing to me what your husband did to you. He keeps telling me I'm forgetful and paranoid, but I found some things that make me think he's been moving my belongings and changing things in my apartment." I had spent 2 hours with Sarah that evening, helping her document the incidents she was experiencing and connecting her with resources for both legal protection and psychological support. 6 months later, she sent me a photo from her college graduation, free from the relationship that had been undermining her confidence and academic performance. "You saved my life," her accompanying note had read, "not just by sharing your story, but by showing me that I could trust my own mind even when someone was trying to convince me I couldn't." These interactions had given my experience a meaning beyond personal vindication. David's crimes had inadvertently equipped me to help other women recognize and escape similar manipulation, turning his attempted destruction of my life into a force for protecting others. The financial restitution ordered by the court had also provided resources for expanding my advocacy work. David had been required to pay damages that included not just the money he had attempted to steal, but compensation for the psychological harm he had inflicted, and the professional opportunities I had lost during the period of his manipulation. Ashley's assets, though more limited, had also been seized to contribute to the restitution payment. Her luxury apartment, expensive car, and investment accounts had all been liquidated to help compensate for the damage their conspiracy had caused. The house in Myers Park where David had conducted his psychological warfare had been sold as part of the divorce settlement, with the proceeds contributing to my new business and the victim advocacy fund I had established. I had no desire to return to a space that held so many memories of manipulation and deception. Instead, I had purchased a beautiful townhouse in the historic Dilworth neighborhood, a space that felt entirely mine and reflected my authentic taste rather than the carefully curated image David had preferred. The clean lines and natural light of my new home provided a daily reminder of the clarity I had fought so hard to reclaim. My social life had also undergone a complete transformation. The careful isolation David had engineered had given way to genuine friendships with people who appreciated my intelligence and integrity. My colleagues at Richardson Strategic Solutions had become not just business partners, but trusted friends who understood and supported my journey. Dating had been the last frontier in rebuilding my life, something I had approached with understandable caution after experiencing such profound betrayal. But 8 months after David's sentencing, I had begun seeing Marcus Thompson, a fellow entrepreneur who owned a successful marketing firm in Charlotte. Marcus had known about my story from the media coverage, but he had been drawn to my strength and resilience rather than viewing me as damaged or vulnerable. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than the manipulative charm that had characterized my marriage to David. "What amazes me about you," Marcus had said during one of our early conversations, "isn't that you survived what David did to you. It's that you transformed it into something positive. You turned his attempt to destroy you into a platform for helping others and building something better than what you had before." The contrast between Marcus's authentic affection and David's calculated performance was striking. Where David had used compliments and affection as tools of manipulation, Marcus offered genuine appreciation for who I was, rather than who he wanted me to become. On a personal level, the most profound change had been in my relationship with my own mind. For 18 months, David had trained me to question every instinct, doubt every memory, and second-guess every perception. Now I trusted my thoughts and feelings completely, having learned that my instincts had been correct even when I was being systematically gaslit. This transformation had made me more effective in every area of my life. In business, I made decisions with confidence and stood behind them even when others disagreed. In relationships, I communicated clearly and directly, no longer afraid that my perceptions might be wrong. In advocacy work, I spoke with the authority of someone who had experienced the worst kind of psychological manipulation and emerged stronger. The legal proceedings had also established important precedent for prosecuting similar cases. Michael Chen had explained that my case was being studied by prosecutors and law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how to effectively investigate and prosecute sophisticated psychological abuse. "Your willingness to document everything and pursue justice has created a roadmap for other victims," Michael had told me. "The evidence you gathered and the way you presented it has shown that these cases can be won, even when the manipulation is subtle and sophisticated." Several law schools had invited me to speak about the legal aspects of psychological abuse, and my case had been included in textbooks about domestic violence and financial exploitation. The woman who had once been told she was losing her mind was now teaching future lawyers how to recognize and prosecute psychological manipulation. The media attention had also led to opportunities in writing and speaking that I had never considered. A major publisher had approached me about writing a book detailing my experience, not as a victim's memoir but as a practical guide for recognizing and escaping psychological manipulation. The book proposal had outlined chapters on recognizing gaslighting techniques, documenting abuse, building support systems, and pursuing legal remedies. My experience had given me unique insights into both the victim's perspective and the legal strategies necessary for achieving justice. "Your story needs to be told," the publisher had said, "not just because it's compelling, but because it provides hope and practical guidance for women who are experiencing similar abuse. You've shown that sophisticated manipulation can be defeated with evidence, determination, and the right support system." Writing the book had been both therapeutic and empowering, allowing me to process my experience while creating a resource that could help others. The manuscript was scheduled for publication the following year, with plans for a national book tour and media appearances. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the professional destruction of David's reputation in Charlotte's business community. His arrest and conviction had made him a pariah among the successful real estate professionals he had once counted as peers. Several of David's former clients had contacted me after his conviction, expressing regret that they had believed his narrative about my mental health problems. Some had even apologized for avoiding me during the period when David was spreading rumors about my psychological instability. "We should have known something wasn't right," one prominent developer had told me. "Your work was always excellent, even during the time when David claimed you were having problems. We should have trusted our own observations instead of his explanations." These conversations had provided additional validation that my professional competence had remained intact, even during David's manipulation campaign. The confusion and forgetfulness he had attributed to mental illness had been isolated to situations where he had direct control over the information and environment. Ashley's professional destruction had been equally complete. Her conviction had not only ended her real estate career, but had made her unemployable in any field requiring trust or professional responsibility. The woman who, luggage and briefcase, checking his phone one more time before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "I'll call you when I land," he said, giving me one final kiss goodbye. "And Emma, please don't worry too much about Tuesday. Whatever Dr. Williams finds, we'll handle it together. I love you." "I love you too," I managed to say, the words feeling foreign and bitter in my mouth. After his car pulled out of our driveway, I remained standing at the kitchen window for several minutes, processing everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. The woman who had woken up this morning was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the game being played against her. But understanding the game was only the first step. Now I had to figure out how to win it. I had 5 days until the psychiatric evaluation that was supposed to be the final nail in my coffin. 5 days to gather evidence, build a defense, and turn David's elaborate plan against him. 5 days to save my sanity, my freedom, and my future. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's own arrogance had provided me with the tools I needed. His text messages were detailed documentation of a criminal conspiracy. His methods were now exposed, which meant I could counter them. His timeline gave me a narrow window of opportunity, but it was enough. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like myself again. Not the confused, paranoid, forgetful woman David had been systematically creating, but Emma Richardson, the sharp marketing professional who had built a successful career by outthinking her competition. The woman who had inherited not just money from her grandmother, but also her fierce intelligence and unbreakable will. David had made the mistake of underestimating me, assuming that his psychological manipulation had broken me completely. He had no idea that discovering his betrayal hadn't shattered me further, but had actually restored me to my full strength. As I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the home he was planning to steal and the life he was trying to destroy, I began to plan my counterattack. Dr. Patricia Williams was expecting to evaluate a mentally deteriorating woman who needed immediate intervention. Instead, she was going to meet someone very different, someone who had evidence, someone who had been pushed too far, someone who was ready to fight back. The appointment on Tuesday was still going to be the turning point David expected, just not in the way he had planned. The silence in our Myers Park home felt different now that David was gone. For 18 months I had dreaded being alone, afraid of the strange sounds and confused thoughts that seemed to plague me when he wasn't there to provide stability. Now I understood that those fears had been manufactured, and the silence felt like freedom. I spent the first day after David's departure doing something I hadn't done in over a year, trusting my own instincts completely. I started by methodically searching our house for evidence of his manipulation campaign, and what I found exceeded even my worst expectations. In the basement storage room, hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, I discovered a small electronic device that looked like a modified baby monitor. When I examined it more closely, I realized it was the source of the mysterious whispers I had been hearing at night. David had been using it to broadcast faint sounds through our home's ventilation system, sounds that were just barely audible and designed to make me question whether I was hearing things. The device was connected to a timer system that would activate it at random intervals during the night, ensuring that the sounds seemed unpredictable and therefore more likely to be dismissed as hallucinations. There was even a small speaker hidden in the wall behind our bedroom headboard, so cleverly concealed that I never would have found it if I hadn't known to look. In David's home office, I found a folder labeled Project Files that contained detailed documentation of his manipulation campaign. He had kept meticulous records of every incident, every planted doubt, every manufactured confusion. The folder contained a timeline of my supposed psychological decline, complete with dates, methods used, and my reactions to each manipulation. One section was titled Memory Disruption Techniques, and included strategies for making me doubt my recollections of conversations and events. David had been recording our interactions with a small digital recorder, then editing the recordings to change key details before playing them back to me later. When I expressed confusion about these altered conversations, he would act concerned about my memory and suggest that I might be misremembering things due to stress. Another section detailed environmental gaslighting methods. This included moving my personal items to different locations, changing temperature settings in the house and then denying it when I noticed, and subtly rearranging furniture so that I would bump into things and feel disoriented in my own home. He had even been adding small amounts of sleep medication to my evening tea, not enough to make me unconscious, but enough to make me groggy and more susceptible to confusion. The most chilling section was labeled Isolation Strategies. David had been systematically undermining my relationships with friends and family, not through obvious sabotage but through subtle manipulation. He would share carefully edited versions of my confused behavior with my sister Jennifer, expressing concern about my mental state while positioning himself as the patient, loving husband trying to help his struggling wife. He had been intercepting some of my text messages and emails, responding to friends and family in ways that made me seem unreliable or antisocial. When people stopped reaching out as frequently, David would comfort me about my apparent social isolation while secretly being the cause of it. I found copies of emails David had sent to Dr. Patricia Williams before scheduling my appointment. In these messages, he presented himself as a desperate husband, seeking help for his wife's deteriorating mental condition. He described episodes of paranoia, memory loss, and erratic behavior, many of which were either completely fabricated or were actually my natural reactions to his deliberate manipulation. Most damaging was a series of photographs David had taken of the journal entries he had planted in my belongings. He had photographed pages of handwriting that looked convincingly like mine but contained disturbing, paranoid thoughts that I would never have written. These photos were included in his communications with Dr. Williams as evidence of my psychological decline. Reading these files, I began to understand the true scope of David's planning. This wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by his affair with Ashley. This was a calculated long-term strategy that had been in development for over 2 years, coinciding with my grandmother's death and my inheritance of her substantial estate. David had been researching psychological manipulation techniques, studying gaslighting methods, and consulting with Ashley about the most effective ways to undermine someone's sense of reality. Ashley's background in psychology hadn't been a coincidence. David had specifically cultivated their relationship because of her knowledge in this area. I photographed every document in the folder with my phone, creating a comprehensive record of David's manipulation campaign. Then I carefully returned everything to its original position, ensuring that he would have no reason to suspect I had discovered his files. The next phase of my preparation involved understanding exactly what I was facing with Dr. Williams. I spent hours researching her background, her approach to psychological evaluation, and the specific tests and assessments she was likely to use during our session. Dr. Patricia Williams was a respected clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience, specializing in anxiety disorders and psychological trauma. More importantly, I learned that Dr. Williams had written several papers about the psychological effects of